Hey guys, Mr. Morgan here with another instructional video for remote learning. Today is 10/28. What we're going to talk about today is voting rights and how that has changed over time, and then who is allowed to vote today. And then when we talk about Egypt, we are going to be covering ancient Egypt and make a timeline for ancient Egypt. So let's go ahead and get started by going over again what we talked about yesterday when it came to the election process. So yesterday we talked some about the election process and we read some about it. So I just want to go through the three things that we covered. So if we think about the election process like a board game or like a video game, there are a couple of different levels and steps and things that we can go through. So if we look at what I have here, okay, if we look at what I have here on my iPad, this was in our PDF assignment for yesterday about the election process. Before anyone can even run for president, they have to meet three requirements. Those three requirements are right here. And we can see that it says you have to be a natural born citizen. You have to be born in the United States or the United States territory controlled area like a military base would count. So my parents met in San Antonio, but had my dad met my mom when he was stationed in Germany, and had I been born in Germany, I wouldn't be a natural born citizen. However, if I was born on a American air base in Germany, that would count. And so I would then be considered a natural born citizen, even though I wasn't born in America. So you have to be a natural born citizen. Next thing we have is a minimum age of 35 years. You have to have some sort of experience. 35 years of age is the youngest you can be when you run for president. The last thing we have is U.S. resident for 14 years. You have to have been in the United States, lived here for a period of time, have to have some ties to the country before people are willing to let you run it. And so we have U.S. resident for 14 years. You have to have lived and owned land in the area. So now we have those three things done. We can move on towards our uh, our first step, our first of our three steps that we talked about. This was the second question we went through. The three steps are primaries and caucuses, and then we have national conventions and a general election. So the way this works is primaries and caucuses are essentially like an election before the election. So the Democratic Party and the Republican Party will both have primaries in every state, and this is when we have uh, people running against each other. We have a bunch of different people. So in the Democratic primaries, we had people like Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and a litany of other people all running to be the Democratic nominee for president. There can only be one. And so this is their chance. This is them fighting to become that person. So primary, we have elections. And so we have like elections and people voting. And so the way it works is every state has their own primary. And as people do and compete in the primaries and get votes, the more votes you get, the more delegates you get. So over time, people start to get more delegates. So let's say we have A, B, and C here. Person A and person B get a lot of delegates. They do very well in the primaries, but person C does not do very well, and so they don't get as many votes in the primaries and don't get as many delegates. And so over time, this would just go on and go on, and person C may drop out of the race because they realize that they can no longer win or they run out of money. And so they might drop out of the race, and they might drop out of the race in order to uh, allow another candidate to do better or support another candidate. Uh, Many people will drop out of the race and we'll end up with two people. And this is when we get to step two, the national conventions. This is a big event that the Republican and Democratic Party hold every year or hold every 4 years, in which they choose the person that they are going to have on the ticket for the election. So in the Republican Party, when they had their national convention, they chose Donald Trump, obviously the president who was running again, for their nominee. And then in the Democratic Party, they had Joe Biden. And this is also when we see that they picked their running mate, their vice president. So for Donald Trump, we had Mike Pence, who was the sitting vice president. And then Joe Biden selected Kamala Harris as his vice president. And now we have two people running against each other in the presidential election. The next step that we have is, after all of the debates and town halls and going to rallies and all sorts of things, campaigning, we have the general election. This is November 3rd, when people go out and vote. This is when we see democracy in action. The general election is when people go out and vote and say who they want to be president. This is not only for president, though, this is for local things as well. So we have things such as in the town of New Haven or Fort Wayne, you will have school boards, judges, sheriffs, mayors, all sorts of things like that. You vote for those. And then in the state of Indiana, you vote for things like senators, governors, and judges on a statewide level. So those are our three steps that we see. Then we have the Electoral College. This is the final thing. So when you vote in a general election, your vote is not actually for the president. Your vote is for who's going to win the state of Indiana or whatever state you live in. So the Electoral College, every state is given a certain number of votes, totaling up to 538 votes. So the magic number that you need is half plus 1. So that would be 270. So we get a tie when we have 269 even, and no one gets to that 270 number. The first person to get to 270 wins the presidential election. So if we look at Indiana, for example, and we say that person A and person B are running against each other, and person A gets 49% of the vote, and then person B gets 50.1% of the vote. Person B is going to get all of the electoral votes for the state of Indiana. So even though person A and person B could be only apart by 1,000 votes, 100 votes, 1 vote, it doesn't matter. If you get the majority in the state, then you get all of the electoral votes for the state, which for Indiana happens to be 11. So the way that they calculate the number of votes that every state gets in the Electoral College is they use the population. So the minimum number that any state can get is 3. So states like Montana, Wyoming, North and South Dakota, which are incredibly empty and have very low populations, they get 3 votes no matter what. Once you get over a certain threshold, you start to get more and more votes. So our very, very populous states are states that have a lot of people, like Florida, New York, California, Texas. The states that have those large populations, they have more and more votes in the Electoral College. So California, for example, has 55 votes because they have so many people. So those votes that have a lot more people are going to see a lot more attention when it comes to campaigning. Places like North and South Dakota and Wyoming are not going to as much, because if you win Florida, Texas, and California, that is 100 of 100, and that is a total of 122 votes for 3 states. If you win Wyoming, Montana, North and South Dakota, West Virginia, Idaho, Maine, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Delaware, all those states combined, those states all have 3, 4, 5 electoral votes. And so combined, those 10 states can potentially only be 36 electoral votes. So it would make more sense to campaign a lot more in a state that has more votes. We have certain states that see a lot of action because they have a large number of votes and they go back and forth. They could easily go to either candidate. These are states like Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan. All these states have 16, 18, 20 votes. So they have a large number of votes, and they're on the fence. They could swing either way. They're swing states. And so in this, we see the Electoral College is the group or the system that actually votes and chooses the president, and they do it. The votes, the number of votes they get are based on population size, and then winner takes all for the state. So that is the electoral process, which we talked about yesterday. Today we were talking about voting rights. So when it comes to voting rights, we are going to be given a link which will take us to a couple of different things that we can open up and see when people gain the right to vote. So what we're going to do is complete a discussion board and talk about who gained the right to vote when, and then make our own timeline. So if we go ahead and open it up, we can see there are a couple different options: the founders in the vote, voting rights for African Americans, for women, for Native Americans, and who can vote today. So go ahead, open each one and see who the founders said were allowed to vote, and then when certain marginalized groups like African Americans, Native Americans, women were allowed to vote. And then we can see who today might be a marginalized group and who today is being restricted from voting. So go ahead, do that, complete the discussion board, and then we can go ahead and get started with our notes for today, which is creating a timeline, another timeline for ancient Egypt. Okay, so let's go ahead, do that, and then we can get started on the notes. Okie dokie. So ancient Egypt timeline, that is what we are doing today. Go ahead and open up the PDF and then complete the notes as we go along with the PowerPoint and the lecture for the rest of today. So if we look at this, we can see it gets broken down into, or we're going to see that it gets broken down into a couple of different eras. So just a brief overview, we're going to do the pre-dynastic era, before a established rule was really implemented in Egypt. And then we can split Egypt into a couple of different things, like we talked about last week with one of the videos that we watched. We have the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and then the New Kingdom. And then we're going to talk about the end of Egyptian reign in the area and who took control and who started to conquer Egypt. So pre-dynastic era. Hunting and fishing communities appear in Nubia around 6000 BCE. So we kind of talked about this yesterday. In the area, the Nile River provides life and allows for life to thrive in the middle of this harsh desert area that is Egypt and Africa. So in this, we see certain animals which attract hunters. These hunters and people fishing in the area start to form some sort of communities in the area. Next, we would see in around 5000 BCE, settlements of farming communities appear in the area. So it started out mainly hunters and fishers in the area, and then we start to see people farming and building larger communities because of that. So at the time, Upper and Lower Egypt were two separate areas, two separate kingdoms. And then through or under Nasser around 3100 BCE, 3100 BCE, we see Upper and Lower Egypt are unified and put together into one state. This is when we start to see the state of Egypt. Not long after, we see hieroglyphics are invented around 3000 BCE. This is one of two forms of writing that they have in Egypt. Hieroglyphics were mostly just used for things like rituals and ceremonies and things like that. It was essentially their fancy script. It was their special script that they only use in certain situations. They had a whole nother written language besides hieroglyphics. So going on now to the Old Kingdom, when we think of Egypt, this is mainly what we think of: the pyramids and sphinxes, stuff like that. This is all primarily the Old Kingdom. So this is around 2600 BCE to about probably closer to 2300 BC. So it's about a couple hundred years that we see most of this start to happen. We have a bunch of kings rule over the area for a number of years, and in that time, every king wants to build up their massive tomb. So one of the reasons that we see this is that kings were often equated to gods and even became living gods. And so the Egyptian people believed that in order to keep peace and order in the world, you needed to appease the gods and make the gods happy. So with the kings becoming living gods, you had to ensure that they would be happy for the rest of their lives. And so you had to build a tomb allowing a peaceful afterlife for the kings, which is what we see all the pyramids are. They're all a bunch of tombs. Even the Sphinx, for example, is another sort of tomb that we see in this area. So these are massive structures. We see a bunch of different kinds, which we talked about with the e-learning, things like the step pyramids at the start. And then as they tried to progress and make even better and stronger, longer lasting pyramids, we see things like the bent pyramid, where they started very steep and then realized they can't keep it that steep, and they level it out more at the top. And so it looks, instead of like a normal pyramid like this, it starts out like this, and then the top comes more at an angle and it becomes bent. So we see builders begin constructing the Great Pyramid at Giza around 2589 BC. Next, we have the Great Sphinx statue is completed around 2533 BCE. So around this time, anywhere between 2600 and 2500 is where we see the majority of the pyramids being built. So this is the height of the Old Kingdom, this time when we have these kings and these rulers of Egypt building these massive pyramids. In between each kingdom, we have a sort of an intermediate area where people are fighting, there's civil war, civil unrest, and so we see a bunch of different people moving in and attacking, invading, and then all of a sudden we see them start to form a new Egyptian state in the Middle Kingdom. So when we see the Middle Kingdom start to form, we see Mentuhotep II wins a civil war and reunites Egypt under one state in around 2040 BCE. So this is about 4,060 years ago. We see that Mentuhotep reunites Egypt for a second great kingdom. Around 1925 BCE, we see trade between the Egyptians and the Mesopotamian people, another great river valley civilization, one of the rival great civilizations in the area, who's quite a distance away. We see trade and cultural exchange between the two groups. Things like chariots and horses and the compound bow all come from the Mesopotamians. Next thing that we're going to see is Senusret the Third would conquer the Nubians and the Canaanites. This is when we start to see a lot more expanse. So in the Middle Kingdom, we see a lot of we see unification, and then we see them start to interact more and more with people around them, both peacefully through things like the Mesopotamian trade and cultural exchanges, and then them start to expand some, which we're going to see a lot more later. So them conquering the Nubians in the north and the Canaanites to the east, I believe, in around 1850 BCE. The Middle Kingdom would start to end, getting closer towards 1700 BCE, when social unrest and invasion ends the Middle Kingdom around 1750. It wasn't an immediate end. It was something that happened sort of gradually. Things started to fall apart. And so we start to see, between social unrest and people not being happy starting to rise up, and then invaders coming in, we start to see that the Middle Kingdom ends around 1750 BCE. So this moves us on to our last kingdom. This is the New Kingdom. So the New Kingdom begins around 1550, 1560, around 1560 BCE, and we start to see this period of massive expansion of the Egyptian Empire. So Thutmose III, his reign begins in 1504 BCE or 1505, and we see that he embarks on this massive expansion of the empire into modern-day Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan, going through Mesopotamia, conquering all of modern-day Egypt, and when at the time when the New Kingdom started, Egypt was essentially just the areas around the Nile River and then up by the Mediterranean Sea. He expanded it massively into parts of Sudan today, moving down further south into more of Africa. So Thutmose III's daughter, Hatshepsut, married a man who would then be called Thutmose II. And so as Thutmose III passed away, Thutmose II takes over, and then as the next and so on goes forth, we see that Hatshepsut rules over in place of this young child who is put in charge. And so eventually she becomes ruler of Egypt, her own. So we have Queen Hatshepsut rules over Egypt, 1482 BCE. The next thing that we're going to have, even though it doesn't last very long, we have the reign of King Tutankhamun, who only rules for about 9 years. He becomes king at around, I think it was around 8 or 9 years old, and then he rules until he's about 17, 18 when he passes away. So he was born and he was incredibly unhealthy because of a number of reasons. One being inbreeding. Royalty only had children with those of other royalty, and then there was often this trend of marrying people in your own family in order to keep the bloodline pure. Well, what happened with that is way on down the line, the children of these couples were incredibly unhealthy and had a lot of issues. One example is King Tut. So the main thing that King Tut did was that he re-solidified certain deities and gods in the Egyptian pantheon. So King Tut reigned from 1334 to 1325 BCE before he would be buried in the Valley of the Kings. This was an area where during the New Kingdom, no pyramids were built. The pyramids were all built during the Old Kingdom. And so even though this is about 2,000 or 1,500 years later, King Tut would still be considered or thought of alongside of things like the Sphinx and the pyramid. He actually just had a tomb in this valley where all of the kings and queens at the time would all be buried. And so we see King Tut is buried in his tomb in the Valley of the Kings. The main reason that he is so popular is because, or so famous, is because he was completely intact when the English found his tomb later on down the road. Many of the Egyptian kings and the Egyptian queens, all these tombs and the pyramids were all ravaged by grave robbers before historians and archaeologists could get to them. But King Tut wasn't, so all of his stuff was wholly intact for the most part. And so that is why King Tut is perhaps the most famous of the Egyptian pharaohs and Egyptian kings, because he was, all of the stuff that he did and had, all of his tomb and his burial belongings were mostly untouched. So it's the best we can get a glimpse at what they actually did for a lot of their burial practices besides reading. The last thing that we have when it comes to this timeline is the end of the Egyptian Empire and the Egyptian kingdom as a whole. So around 1000 BCE, we see that Egyptian empire starts to fall apart and not become as powerful, start to diminish somewhat. And then we see later on down the road that people take advantage of this weakened Egypt state and Egyptian empire, and they start to conquer it. We see the Persians conquer around 525 BCE. And then later, Alexander the Great conquers the Persian-controlled Egypt in 332 BCE. And then way on down the line, we would see today that Egypt is now a modern country with a lot of this rich history still intact that people can go and visit. So that is our ancient Egypt timeline for today. Tomorrow we are going to be talking about, I think we're talking about the Egyptian pharaohs, either the Egyptian pharaohs or the gods, I can't remember, but I will see you guys tomorrow. Let me know if there's anything you need or any questions you need help with. Shoot me a message on Canvas. I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. Have a great day. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye.